It's my great pleasure now to move to the next section of today's event and introduce my great colleague, Dr. Gill Main, and her colleague as well from Leeds City Council, Amelia. So very pleased to meet you both here today. Amelia is the Senior Policy Development Officer with Leeds City Council and lead, I believe, on child poverty strategy and looking at the issues also around period poverty, which has been a focus of work within the city as well. I'm aware of that. And including managing a large project, I understand, about holiday hunger, which is something that concerns many of us here at the university, and I'm sure many of the audience as well. So welcome, Amelia. Also, Gill, it's very lovely to have you here today as part of this event. Gill's work on the impact of poverty and class and intersecting forms of oppression and disadvantage on the lives of children and young people is very powerful, very impactful, and I've always been a great admirer of the work that she has done. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you both to begin your presentation.
Thank you very much, Angharad. That's fantastic. Can we have our first slide, please? So yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. Amelia and I have been working on anti-poverty research, policy and practice for many years now, hasn't it been, Amelia? Yeah. We always enjoy the chance to have a good conversation about this, and it's fantastic to be able to share one of our conversations with a wider audience. So thank you so much for joining us. Could I have the second slide, please? So rather than present a particular research project, we thought it would be more interesting to talk about the overall approach that we've taken in the work that we've been doing and the changes that it's produced. What we're doing is very much a work in progress, and it's going to remain that until poverty has been eliminated. So we have to take a really long-term view, be flexible in what we do, how we do it, and why we focus on particular issues and topics over time. So we'll start by saying why, for us, it's necessary that experts by experience are at the centre of anti-poverty work. Then we'll outline some of the barriers we've experienced and how we've negotiated some of them. We try to reflect regularly on the ethos underpinning the work that we do to make sure that we do have those strong ethical underpinnings. So we'll share some of our reflections on that. And finally, we'll share some details on a range of projects we're working on and some links to some resources if you want to follow up on any of these projects. Next slide, please. So starting with who we mean when we say experts by experience, these are the children, young people and parents who have experience of living in poverty. You won't be surprised to hear that lots of other marginalised identities intersect with that. People with disabilities, people who are racially minoritised, women, lone parents and many other groups are substantially overrepresented among these experts by experience. All of these identities make it easy for us to ignore experts by experience. And for Amelia and I, this creates an ethical responsibility to work towards centering those perspectives in how we understand, measure and address child poverty. The crowding out of experts by experience happens at a range of levels. So theoretically, approaches to understanding poverty tend to focus on freedoms and on control over resources. And these concepts are complex to apply to the lives of children because their autonomy is heavily constrained. These experts are often not politically active, or because of their age, they're excluded from the electorate. And that makes their needs easier to ignore in populist policy making. So this links to the kind of status associated both with poverty and with childhood. Poor children face a dual form of exclusion because they're associated with lower status, both identities. And if we start to consider then the intersectional impact of gendered, racially minoritized and disabled identities here, we can easily see how it's easy to exclude experts by experience from anti-poverty work. So we believe that this provides a substantial ethical responsibility for us to make space for these perspectives, to take them seriously and to treat them with respect. And when we do that, we see that inclusion is actually a pragmatic necessity as well. Anti-poverty policy doesn't work if the experiences of those who are living in poverty aren't included. For example, a common reason for anti-poverty policy failures is that the impact of stigma and the stigmatizing nature of interventions is often not taken into consideration. Adults tend to think that children don't understand or experience this stigma, but that's repeatedly disproven when we do listen to children. And that links to the final reason why we think this is so important. Amelia and I both have expertise by experience. We both grew up in poverty. We spent a long time discussing whether and how we should mention this. And by the way, I want to make it clear that I'm saying this with Amelia's consent and agreement. We decided that being really clear about this part of our motivation is important in contributing to challenging the stigma of poverty. We've both got personal experience during childhood of being excluded from decisions, of being shamed and of being stigmatized. And now we have a platform. We want to make sure that we use that to amplify the voices of the people who have least access to opportunities to be heard and taken seriously. Could we have the next slide, please? So, moving on to some of the barriers we faced in listening to and hearing experts by experience. From an academic perspective and within wider policy and societal discussions of poverty, there's still a really strong deficit model. As I mentioned before, both the statuses of child and of poor are treated as lesser in the majority of studies and discussions of poverty. And that means that our approach is often treated as soft, as unnecessary, as misguided, and at best as an add-on to the real research. We've both experienced these challenges overtly from colleagues within academia and policy circles, as well as in conversations with people we know. And I'm going to now hand over to Amelia.
Thank you, Gill. As Gill's discussed, children and young people, especially those who live in poverty, are often excluded from decisions around policy and practice that impact on their lives. And when they are included, there's a tendency for this to be more of a tick box exercise. So the policies are created, they go through all of the processes, the projects are developed, and then there's a period of consultation in which generally parents and carers and teachers and some children and young people potentially are asked if they're happy with these plans. But this fits into the tokenism category. The children and young people haven't actually been given the opportunity to shape or influence the thinking behind the work. They have been included, but in a way that benefits those who are making the policies rather than the children and young people themselves. The way that we're trying to work involves working alongside children, young people and parents, where possible from the very beginning. So instead of saying, this is what we're doing, this is how we're doing it, is that okay? We say, what do we need to do? What's the problem? Where can we fit in? And what are children, young people and parents actually saying are the things that affect their lives and that they would like to be focused on? It does take more time and there are a lot more barriers to overcome this way, but it actually means that the outcome is meaningful and you have impactful policies, projects and research. It's also a better use of resource and funding, and it goes away from that tick box exercise or the complete omission that does tend to happen when we're talking about including children, young people and parents in policies and projects around poverty. Within local and national government context, so I work within a local government context, and the complexity that we often face is how can we create meaningful inclusion and creation of projects when the funding and the timescales of those projects are often very tight and very limited. The way academia works and the way local and national government works is often very different, with national government providing funding at short notice with specific criteria. For example, we had some funding under the COVID winter grant scheme, which was quite a big chunk of money that was released in December to provide food and fuel support for children, young people and families and individuals who live in poverty. We received confirmation of that funding and the final guidance on what we could spend, how we can spend it, the criteria, the reporting and the monitoring on the 30th of November. That's the end of November, for the project to begin on the 1st of December. And so there isn't, within timescales like that, there isn't enough time to actually then embed a meaningful approach working with children and young people and parents. However, what we do need to look at is what can we do, rather than just we can't do anything because the barriers are so significant. So one of the things that we've been doing is try to change the way that people understand research, especially within the local authority context. The general assumption and understanding is that it's time consuming, it's written in a way that isn't accessible, and that it isn't really worth doing because of those barriers. And especially when considered with the tight timescales and the requirements that we often have. However, these barriers aren't unachievable. It can be time consuming, but it also cannot be. It can be written in a way that isn't always accessible. However, it can also be presented in a way that is accessible, both to children, young people, parents, and local contexts, national contexts. And what we've been looking at is what are the little steps that we can take, instead of just saying, well, it's not feasible to do anything. It's what is feasible. So one of the things that we're doing, for example, over the summer is working within our Healthy Holidays scheme, which is our scheme to provide foods and activities to children and young people who live in poverty. And we're looking at how we can integrate some form of research into that, to listen to children, young people and parents within a specific area of Leeds, to see how they experience the programme and what they think we could do to shape the programme around the local needs. And it's not citywide, it's not representative of all communities, it's not representative of all children and young people, but it's something. And then when we have that, we can then build on it and build on it and build on it. Can we go to the next slide, please? So our ethos. So we are underpinned by the theoretical and empirical evidence. We firmly believe that we cannot understand the impact of projects and programmes without listening to those who are affected by them. We need a research basis to do the work that we do. And the stories that we capture and the data that we capture and the things that we present and how we present them are fundamentally important to the continuation of funding, as well as to the integration of children, young people and parents, knowledge and perspectives into all of these things. So one example of this is that the Department for Education was quite firm within our project, within the Healthy Holidays project, that we could only spend the funding on those who are eligible for free school meals. Now in Leeds, there's about 30,500 children who are eligible for free school meals, and there's about 36,000 children who are living on a low income. So there is a gap of children who are living in poverty, but who aren't eligible for free school meals. And we presented this to the Department for Education, and the initial response was, you can spend it on those children who are eligible for free school meals, but not on those who aren't. And we received that, and we received that, and we received that. And so then we started presenting some of the research that we conducted and some of the stories that we've captured. And one of the things that we told them is feedback from all our Healthy Holidays groups. And I'm just going to read out the quote from this group. And they'd said, one mum who is a single parent with one child, who's on a debt management plan after fleeing from domestic violence. She is working, but she's been furloughed and she doesn't qualify for any benefits. She is just keeping her head above water and has told that towards the end of each month, she often goes without food and her child lives on dried pasta and bread. She told us that the food provided through the Healthy Holidays scheme was a godsend to her and meant she didn't have to spend any of her own money to provide food for herself and her child through the 2-week period of Easter holidays. Now, that quote, those few lines that we presented to the Department for Education, enabled us to push harder for the inclusion of those who aren't eligible for free school meals, but who are living in poverty. And they came back to us and said that we're allowed up to 15% if we can evidence that we are reaching a good proportion of the free school meal cohort. And it's those kind of things that we need to be able to capture, to be able to kind of push for the things that are really important, not just for us, but for those children, young people and parents. We're also informed by the understanding of local context. Each context is different, and we can't take a general approach to all of them, but we do need to understand the specific context on the ground. And there's this gap often by what we mean by context. So when we talk about communities in Leeds City Council, we might be talking about the wards. However, if you talk to people about where they live, their community isn't often on a ward level, it's often on a street level, maybe to the local shop and back, maybe to school and back. And so we need to look at who who has control over the language and who has control over those definitions. Because if we're saying, well, it meets the need of communities, which communities are we talking about? Who have we talked to actually understand the needs of the communities? So when we talk about local context, it isn't just our definition of local context, but it's actually looking at the local community's definition of local contexts. And it needs to be shaped by strong on the ground relationships. As Gill has said, we've both experienced poverty, and it's something that's really hard to talk about, even though we're not within that context anymore. And these topics are really sensitive, and we can't expect people to talk about them without having these trusting relationships between people. Poverty is often individualized and stigmatized, so people generally hear the rhetoric from the government that poverty is their fault, and it's something that is a consequence of the actions that they have taken. And so there's a huge amount of stigma and shame that surrounds those who live in poverty, whereas actually poverty isn't their fault. Poverty is a result of a failing structure. It's not down to the individual, which is why we need to change structures rather than individuals. We don't need to change individual behaviour. Those who live in poverty aren't doing anything differently. They're just trying to do, as Gill's research has shown, they're trying to do the same amount with much less resource and far more barriers. And so we need to look at actually how we structure the council and even the government around those who live in poverty, rather than looking at what the council can provide. So one of the things that we've done as an example of this is looking at the way that we actually understand poverty. And one of the things that we've done is looking at the merging of knowledge. And so Gill's going to talk briefly about a different take fourth world, and the merging of knowledge that we've done with them.
Yeah, thanks, Amelia. So I'm aware that we need to conclude quite quickly now, so I'll just very briefly say this kind of idea of merging academic, policy, practice and experiential expertise is so important. And an organisation called ATD, Altogether in Dignity Fourth World, were really helpful to us. We've worked closely with them to develop this, drawing on their methodologies around that. These ways that we can bring different kinds of knowledge together and challenge hierarchies of knowledge where certain kinds of expertise are treated as more important than each other. Should we go to the next slide now, Amelia, so we can just briefly say something about the projects? Fab, thank you.
So we've worked on a different take, where we've created Snakes and Ladders boards with children, young people and parents who are experts by experience. And the Snakes and Ladders boards, they look at the kind of the complexities of living in poverty, and they talk about the impact of poverty on their lives. And we've played these games with policymakers, with practitioners, with head teachers to look at the understandings of poverty. We've also been advocating with young people to policy leaders. So we've spoken to different civil service leaders with children, young people who have experienced poverty, to look at really integrating the needs of children, young people who have experienced poverty within high levels policies and practice. And we've also been looking at the Talking About Poverty toolkit, which Gill can mention briefly.
Yeah, so the Talking About Poverty toolkit really came out of some of these projects and realizing that lots of people want to have the conversation, lots of professionals and policymakers, as well as individuals experiencing poverty, but don't feel like they have the tools. So what this toolkit is about is creating opportunities and environments and exercises that we can do to make talking about poverty more accessible, so that we can start the conversation, start to change attitudes and experiences at that community level, which will hopefully filter up to wider societal change. There's lots more which we haven't got time to talk about. Amelia and I have put some links to different resources based on these projects, thank you, and more on the next slide. So please do have a look at them. We'd be delighted to have conversations with anyone and everyone about how we can build on this work, how we can include more and more experts by experience in what we do and how we do it, working towards making the world a better place for people living in poverty while we have poverty, and ultimately eradicating poverty altogether. So yeah, thank you so much, and thanks, Amelia. Sorry, I kind of took over that last section.
Thanks, Jill.
I may just let Stuart talk now. As I said previously, Stuart is our Dean for Research and Innovation at the Faculty of Social Sciences. Stuart, we introduced you earlier, and it's a pleasure to have you here. So would you like to take the lead and ask one or two questions to our invited speakers? Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Michaelis, and thanks to Jill and Amelia for that really rich and insightful presentation. And just before we turn to the questions, just to say I'm really pleased that I've been able to join you this morning for this really important workshop organised by the Inclusion, Childhood and Youth Research Centre. And many of our audience will know that this is one of our a real jewel in the research architecture of the Faculty of Social Sciences. And I should just say that I think, you know, the centre does some hugely important work, particularly conducting interdisciplinary research with high impact potential, and a great deal of which is driven by the ambition to have a positive impact by addressing different forms of social inequality and promoting social inclusion. So I think, you know, in that context, what we just heard is really important. And it also, listening to the presentation, really chimes with the university's new strategy. And I think the work of Amelia and Jill really does embody the core themes of the university, in that it's underpinned by a long-standing and highly fruitful civic collaboration between the University of Leeds and Leeds City Council. It is, as I mentioned, highly impactful and makes a genuine and real positive difference to people's lives in the community. So thank you for all you're doing in that regard. Turning to the questions, we have a question which says that experts by experience is a powerful way of recognizing difference. Would you like to expand further on that? Are you thinking already of next steps projects in this frame?
So shall I say a bit, Amelia?
Yeah, go for it.
So yeah, experts by experience was something Amelia and I spent a long time talking about and discussing actually with the people who we were working with about how we should frame this. And it felt like the most appropriate way of framing it, because it does just challenge that kind of hierarchy where academic knowledge, policy knowledge is placed kind of at the highest level, and then we have maybe practice knowledge, and then this kind of at the bottom of that we've got people who we might be able to extract data from, but who we don't treat as having expertise. So it was something that we wanted to do to really make sure that expertise is acknowledged, to communicate to the people we're working with. So this is how we framed it in adverts for recruitment of participants and so on. And also, I think something that's important is that it goes along with paying people for taking part in this work. So our experts by experience were paid for their contributions to this project. They were trained in doing peer research.
think we've just lost sound. Sorry, Jill. So yeah, so as Jill was saying, that we looked at a variety of ways that we could kind of thank the experts by experience for their time, because it isn't just about, as Jill said, kind of extracting the data. It is about looking at everyone on equal footing. Those who are kind of creating the research projects and those who are creating the policies and the projects or the strategies don't necessarily have more knowledge or greater knowledge than those who have lived through these things themselves. And so that lived experience is really, really crucial to integrate into the work that we've been doing. And it just means that the work that we're doing is actually, it's kind, but it's appropriate, and it's actually informed by the things that will make a difference. The big problem that I have is when there's a lot of funding channeled into something and put out there in a way that hasn't consulted with anyone and hasn't consulted with the communities, and then it isn't used or it isn't taken up. And for me, that's devastating, because you had something that could have made an impact and could have made a difference. And instead of listening to how it's best to make an impact and a difference, it's been done in a way that then doesn't have an impact and doesn't make a difference. And I think that a good way of getting about that is to listen to experts by experience, to think about how we best using this funding, how we best using this resource that we have, because to waste it is a massive shame.